Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video, I'd like to discuss the classic radio program The Six Shooter, which starred James Stewart and only ran for a single season in 1953 to 1954, lasting a total of 39 episodes. There's several reasons why this series is important. One is where it comes in the history of old-time Golden Age radio programs, as being 1953 puts it at the tail end of the popularity of radio, as television had already gained a foothold in American homes, and the idea of getting a big name star to headline a series was seen as a means of trying to have one last attempt at a big series with a big headline name around it. But this is also key because of where it comes in James Stewart's career, because this is Jimmy Stewart doing a Western series right in the middle and in between his groundbreaking landmark masterpiece Western collaborations with director Anthony Mann. They made a total of 8 films together. 5 of them are Westerns, and all 5 Westerns are among the greatest and most important ever made because of their mixture of elements of what Mann had been doing in his earlier films that were much more film noir, using real outdoor practical locations, but most of all for the degrees of psychological complexity in all 5 films. They are very much variations on a theme, but each one stands alone and completely unique, yet they all form a collective whole. And so in between these iconic masterworks of the genre, you have one of the great Western stars doing an entire radio series for 39 episodes. So roughly, since they're half-hour episodes, roughly about 20 hours of the Jimmy Stewart Western that you didn't exactly know existed unless you were a big old-time radio fan. The Six Shooter is also connected to the Mann films because the creator and primary writer, Frank Burt, was the co-writer of the 5th and last film, The Man from Laramie. So that means throughout the series, you've got tinges of elements from the Anthony Mann films. You've got moments of suspense and darkness. You've got psychological complexity. But it's also fascinating because this series has moments of comedy and what would be termed a sort of folksy humor. Some episodes have no major gunfights or showdowns or suspense pieces. Some are entirely human stories. And so you basically get a melting pot of different Western themes inside of a show starring James Stewart as the titular six-shooter, a wandering Texas plainsman who basically goes from town to town and trouble finds him, or more often than not, he runs into people who themselves are in some form of trouble and in his own particular way tries to help them solve their problems, usually by being able to think several steps ahead and also have a sense of old-fashioned decency when it's called for. And so this character of Britt Ponset enters into each town or location or each plot scenario. And so you have a bit of the classic Lone Ranger formula of the Lone Ranger and Tonto running into a particular problem or encountering people who have a problem and managing to find a way to solve it by episode's end in not always the most direct ways. And this sort of classical idea runs throughout the Western, the idea of the wandering lone figure who enters into the society and then leaves again, always on his own, always traveling towards the horizon, the forever wanderer. It's such a pure element that is at the core of what the Western means as a genre that the series is immediately recognizable for what it is, but it's playing around with so many different tones that it really, I think, encompasses everything Jimmy Stewart ever did in Westerns, because you've got the lighter elements, such as what you see in the classic Destry Rides Again, but on the other hand, you've got things right out of the Anthony Mann Westerns and the psychological realism, and this series is being made and broadcast between those films. It began while Bend to the River was still on release, which was the second of the 5 Westerns. So it is a remarkable show to look at for simply the time and place in which it was made, as one of the later or last attempts to do a dramatic radio series, and having a big name star do a radio show instead of continuing their typical film career and film output and doing this in between those shows. So you always have to think about how will a star's image translate to being only in audio form. But also, and I think key, is that it's a mixture of all the tones that Stewart would play in every Western he ever made. So you get a fantastic blend of both light and dark. The production values and the overall cast in every episode is excellent. The writing is extremely good, whether it's a serious drama episode or more of a human story, or even a story that's an out-and-out comedy or has farcical elements, or Britt Ponset finds himself in a situation he wanted nothing to do with. In fact, one of the best episodes of the series is Britt Ponset being stuck as the man responsible for getting enough funds so the church can buy a new organ. On the surface, that sounds incredibly simple and not all that interesting, but the episode is a wonderful blend of comedy and drama because the only people Ponset can go to are actually various outlaws in the territory because no one in the town has any money. So what starts as a whimsical, very folksy, humorous episode with Ponset, as always, being sort of reluctantly drawn into things, then adds the tinge of danger and also is able to pivot between comedy and drama quite nicely. And all of this within a 30-minute episode, as all the shows were simply 30-minute radio programs. But the main draw of the series is also what holds it all together, and that's Stewart's performance. If you thought it might be difficult for a film star to translate their success into the world of radio, look no further than Jimmy Stewart here in The Six Shooter, because Stewart's performance is, of course, masterful. I do consider him arguably the greatest screen actor of all time, but his ability to emote is just as impactful here in the theater of the mind, as radio is so often called. Here, you get the sense that Stewart is not just enjoying himself, but deeply invested in the performance every time. It is a fully realized characterization that is, in some areas, similar to his roles in the Anthony Mann films and Destry Rides Again, but completely different to all of them. It is a unique characterization, and what makes it further unique is Stewart is getting to play the same character across all 39 episodes. So you get to see a masterful Stewart performance as a Western hero get lived in a bit more outside the confines of a single film. So he gets to play comedy, he gets to play drama, he gets to play seething, barely controlled rage. He gets to play the suspense moments. Another key highlight of the series is that when there are suspense moments, or it's building up to a gun battle, or Ponset having to try and get the drop on someone, or knows that he's surrounded and he's got to try and get out alive, when things get really tense, everything sort of drops out and everything is heightened further, because the only thing you hear is then the extraordinary performance that Stewart gives of Britt Ponset's actual first-person mental dialogue of what's running through his head. So he's actually describing what's going on, because in radio, that's how you have to convey events, because you don't have the ability to show any visuals, obviously. But it's a brilliant device that uses Stewart's incredible acting ability to actually convey the suspense that can't be conveyed visually. And so the episodes with suspense moments all have these hair-raising, chilling, heart-stopping moments where it is you, the listener, hanging on to every single word that Jimmy Stewart is saying, and it's got all of the tension of the suspense moments of the Anthony Mann Westerns, but in radio form.
I saw him go down real slow, like his legs had buckled under him. I couldn't tell how bad he'd been hit. He rolled down a gully out of range, and I crawled forward. I pushed myself past a couple of rocks and headed toward the back door. The kid was in the kitchen. I couldn't see him, but I could hear him moving around, going from window to window, looking out, waiting for me. I slid past another rock. I could run for the door or wait. The kid made up my mind for me. I slipped down fast, and the bullets nicked the rocks. The kid had good hearing. He knew I was right there. I took out my gun and waited. I knew he'd get nervous first. Young fellas always do. I wasn't so young. I could wait. It wasn't more than 5 minutes before the door started opening. His pony knew I was coming, too. He started for the horse. I aimed at his leg. For a second, he stopped moving and just hung in midair like a hawk. Then he sprawled forward out of sight behind a log. I raised up a little and hunched myself along the side of the cabin. Everything was quiet now. Even his pony. The moon went behind a thick cloud, and I came around the corner of the cabin. Suddenly, the moon came out again, just in time for me to see his .45, just in time to see him coming up over the top of the log.
In fact, the whole series is from the perspective, roughly, of Britt Ponset. So each episode opens and closes with Ponset reflecting where he is at the time.
I had figured on going through Clay City. It was an hour out of my way, and I was already a day late to the Jefferson Ranch where I'd signed on for the roundup. But when Scar started limping from a loose shoe, didn't have no choice. We had to head for the nearest blacksmith shop, so we turned north.
Usually he's on his way to look for another job or join a cattle drive, as he's a working plainsman and he's not looking for trouble, but his skill with a gun is so renowned that he's been given the nickname the six-shooter, and that's of course also in reference to his pistol that he carries. But he has all these legends surrounding him, and each episode is basically giving you another example of how these legends become fact. To use the line from The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, each episode is showing you how the fact of the matter, which is Britt Ponset finding himself in the middle of trouble or trying to help people indirectly, how his actions then become the legend, because as is said in Liberty Valance famously, when choosing between legend and fact, print the legend. So wherever he goes, the notion of him being the six-shooter follows, or people know of him, or they're old friends. So there's a sense of the world outside each individual story, and they form a really wonderful whole when you listen to the whole series, especially because they run the gamut between light and dark. So as a show, I would say it has certainly elements of the Anthony Mann Westerns, elements of Stewart's lighter Westerns like Destry Writes Again, elements of The Lone Ranger, elements of what would become, famous in later TV shows like The Fugitive, where the central character goes in each episode and finds himself in a predicament, and over the course of the story is able to help others in trouble before moving on once again. And that's the classical Western theme that you have in most Western films, and that is truly underlined here, as every episode concludes with Stewart as Ponset riding out on his trusted horse Scar once again, because there's another job to find, there's another town to go to. There's always something else that drives him towards the horizon once more as he rides off into the distance. So it's a beautifully realized concept that is part and parcel the DNA of the Western, and it is fully realized here in radio form. This is a fantastic radio series, and it's all the better because it is coming very late in the era of dramatic radio programs. So you've got all the years and decades of everybody producing fantastic radio shows. And there's also a further poignancy because it is so late for radio. Television was already taking over households, and a lot of shows would wind up being made as television programs instead of radio shows, or would transition from radio to TV. And in fact, The Six Shooter was proposed as a television series. And if you were curious about a visual realization of Jimmy Stewart as Britt Ponset, the Six Shooter, Stewart played either Britt Ponset in name, or a character heavily inspired by the six-shooter, or something adapting one of the radio episode scripts. The first of these was called The Windmill, and it's kind of odd because it's not really an adaptation of the six-shooter, but some of the feeling is there. The key difference is in The Windmill, Stewart is playing a former gunslinger who's gone straight, and he's come into town with his wife and children seeking financing from the bank so they can build a windmill and actually make a success of their attempt at building a ranch. They're not allowed to get the loan, but there's a shooting competition that's going on where it quickly becomes apparent apparent that the Stewart character had a past as some sort of gunslinger, and while he could win the money that they need to build the windmill from the shooting competition, if he does, it will pretty much likely unmask him as a former notorious outlaw figure who might still be wanted somewhere. And if any of those elements sound familiar to the Anthony Mann Westerns, they should, because this was written by Borden Chase, who wrote most of them, and of course the masterpiece first film Winchester 73, which also famously featured a shooting contest between the Stewart character and the villain of the piece. So that was done as a potential pilot for a six-shooter series, and may have been shown as part of a television anthology series once. It has been preserved, so you can actually see it. There's actually versions on YouTube, so I'll link to that in the description. So that's a fascinating what-if scenario, the thought that what if Jimmy Stewart had actually starred in a Western television series in the 50s, and we would then have a whole series of episodes with Jimmy Stewart in more Westerns to look at and study. But it's also got strong connections to the Anthony Mann films because of Borden Chase and a lot of the same themes. John McIntyre also appears in it, and he famously was in some of the Mann films, most notably as the villain in the great fourth Western they did, The Far Country. But as I said, that show was not really a direct adaptation of the six-shooter. However, in the second adjacent television production, this time Stewart actually did play Britt Ponson on screen in a direct adaptation of one of the radio scripts. So for the General Electric Theater in February 1957, you have the one time where Jimmy Stewart played his radio character on screen, retelling the Silver Annie episode, which is about a widow who's still holding on to an old silver mine that's played out, and the town wants her to sell her land to the railroad, but she refuses to give in and opens fire at anybody who comes near her house, which is a wonderful touch. But making it even more interesting is that the widow in the episode is played by Beulah Bondi, who famously acted with Stewart in many films, usually playing his mother, and most famously played his mother in It's a Wonderful Life. So you get to see them on screen again, and you get to see a full visual realization and representation of one of the radio shows. So it lets you know what a Jimmy Stewart television series version of the six-shooter probably would have been like had they actually made one. This episode can thankfully also be seen, and there are several versions here on YouTube. Then there was another adaptation of one of the radio episodes, but with the names changed. This was also for GE Electric Theater. Later in 1957, they adapted the Christmas episode, Britt Ponset's Christmas Carol, and it was renamed The Trail to Christmas. This, unfortunately, I haven't been able to find, but it's a little bit different because they did change the character names for some reason. And then apparently there was one more adaptation of one of the radio episodes for the television program Star Time in 1959, where they adapted one of the radio show episodes, but Stewart actually played one of the supporting characters and somebody else played the lead character, and again, the names have been changed some. So that version is also not available that I know of, but I would hope these would be fully preserved someday, as that means you have not one but four additional James Stewart starring Western programs, which are at least adapting elements or adjacent to the six-shooter radio series. Interestingly, the show was eventually turned into a television series in the late 50s. However, it was under the title The Restless Gun. It was still creator and writer Frank Burt doing the show, but it just didn't have James Stewart in the lead. Instead, it was actor John Payne as basically the same character, but under a different name and a slightly different background. This show, it has actually been released on DVD by Timeless Media Group. You can get the complete series, and I'm curious to watch that series and compare it to the six-shooter original radio version. The Restless Gun did last for 2 seasons, and I believe had 78 total episodes. So eventually the idea to bring it to television did come to fruition, and it lasted 2 seasons. I think there's also 2 truly important elements of the six-shooter that help make it stand out even more, and that's actually the introduction. The opening and closing features the absolutely haunting piece of music entitled Highland Lament, which is the primary theme for the series. This was by the British composer Charles Williams and was arranged by Basil Adler for the radio version. I think this is one of the all-time great Western themes, and it immediately conveys the imagery of the West and the ever-wandering spirit of the character of the six-shooter. And its usage at the start and end of every episode is the perfect transition in and out of each episode. It is unbelievably beautiful, completely evocative, and absolutely haunting. And then the start of every episode, during the unbelievably beautiful and haunting Highland Lament, you have the opening narrator piece, which is describing the character of Britt Ponset and leading into name-dropping the title. It's very simple. It's only a couple sentences, but it is so beautifully done, and combined with Highland Lament playing in the background, you can visualize the character riding past the camera as if it's the start of the title sequence of a classic 1950s Western. But of course, you don't have any visuals, but the emotions are all there. The impact is all there. And so I think this is one of the most beautifully striking yet understated classic radio openings there is.
James Stewart as the six-shooter. The man in the saddle is angular and long-legged. His skin is sun-dyed brown. The gun in his holster is gray steel and rainbow mother of pearl, its handle unmarked. People call them both the six-shooter. The NBC Radio Network presents James Stewart as the six-shooter, a transcribed series of radio dramas based on the life of Britt Ponset, the Texas plainsman who wandered through the Western territories, leaving behind a trail of still remembered legends.
I think this is such an amazing series that anyone will enjoy listening to it. And of course, the great joy of getting into old-time radio is that most radio programs, if they've been preserved or mostly preserved, are actually either in the public domain or their copyright status isn't enforced. So you can freely listen to the entire series, as thankfully all 39 episodes survive, including the test episode, so you actually can hear two different performances of the same episode. So that means there's technically 40 episodes, and you can listen to the entire series, plus you can freely look at least two of the television films that Stewart did in conjunction or are adjacent to the six-shooter, and then you can also look at the eventual television series adaptation, although it's got a different lead actor, and the names are slightly changed. So there's actually quite a bit you can dig into. But the great thing about the six-shooter is you can actually enjoy the entire series for free, and the series has survived in rather high quality, especially compared to what most radio shows are unfortunately like in their preserved status, as the preservation of Golden Age radio programs is incredibly not good, as they were deemed not important to be salvaged, and a lot of shows didn't have transcription discs made, so they were live broadcasts, and you're lucky if there's any surviving recordings or copies, as they typically weren't made, especially earlier on. By the end of Golden Age radio, transcription discs were much more common, and you had syndication, so there's a lot more preservation of radio shows in the late 40s and early 50s, as opposed to the real Golden Age period of the 20s and 30s, where preservation is extremely scarce. And it's incredible that we have the entire series, because this is, I think, truly important for the Western genre. The Six-Shooter is one of the great radio series, it's one of the last great ones, and it's one of the great radio Westerns. And most of all, you have Jimmy Stewart making a fantastic Western series in between his landmark Anthony Mann Westerns, which easily are among the greatest and most important Western films ever made. So that makes this even more important than just having a Jimmy Stewart Western you might not have experienced before, because it's a radio program. This is being made and has elements of the landmark Anthony Mann Westerns, and it's made and released and broadcast right in the middle of them. And you've got one of the screen's great actors just absolutely giving a masterful performance in the radio medium. This is a fantastic series from start to finish. Anybody will enjoy this. And if you're a fan of Westerns, or especially if you're a Jimmy Stewart fan, this is going to be like finding buried treasure if you haven't heard it before, because it is a masterfully realized series with a masterful Jimmy Stewart performance for 39 episodes. And, once you add in the other additional episode and the television adaptations, you've got over 20 hours of a classic Jimmy Stewart Western character and new stories that you've never seen before. It's like suddenly finding not one, but a whole series of James Stewart Westerns that you'd never heard of before, and all of them featuring Stewart playing the same recurring character. So The Six Shooter is an absolute treasure for all of those reasons and more. I absolutely adored listening to this series. It's a wonderful show to listen to over an extended time if you decide you want to try and get into classic radio, and especially because the episodes survive in their entirety. The quality is very high, so they don't suffer from extreme degradation. They're very easy to listen to, and they're freely available. That's the key. So anyone can enjoy almost 20 hours of masterful James Stewart performances in classic Western stories. Now, because they're free to enjoy, you can find versions of the show everywhere. There's uploads all over YouTube as well. I listen to the show via the Old Time Radio Researchers group. Their library is freely available online, where you can access it and look up any show you want to and listen to episodes freely. But they also upload some shows on the Internet Archive in complete collections. They even make burnable CDR versions, so you can download them and just burn to CDs if you want. But I'll have links to the Old Time Radio Researchers group in the description, plus where you can just go to their page on the Internet Archive and actually download the entire series in terms of all the individual episodes. That's the method I used, and the OTRR, as they're known, the Old Time Radio Researchers Group, is really the best place to go to for finding the highest quality versions and most complete presentations that survive of classic radio series. So if you're interested in other Golden Age radio programs, that's where I'd encourage you to go to, either on their website or their invaluable postings on the Internet Archive. Again, all of this will be linked in the description. Being a fan of Westerns, and especially of James Stewart Westerns, coming to The Six Shooter, it's like the lost Jimmy Stewart Western you didn't know existed. That's why this series is so magical, because it's like suddenly finding 20 hours of James Stewart getting to play the same character across all these different Western stories. It is an absolute treasure, and the fact that we have the whole series in high quality and it has survived and you can freely enjoy it means it's one of the absolute highest recommendations I can give to anything, because it's absolutely free and it is such a genuine, fully realized work of art featuring one of the great Western stars and one of the great film actors in the realm of radio, and it's one of the last hurrahs of classic radio dramas at the end of the age of radio, as television was slowly taking over. So those are my thoughts after finishing the classic Six Shooter radio series, one of the great radio programs of the golden age of radio, and an absolute treasure for all Western and James Stewart fans. As I said, I will have links to the show and where you can find it, plus some of the television episodes that were filmed in the description below. All of this stuff is pretty much public domain, or it's in the copyright gray area where the copyright isn't enforced, so you can download the entire show and listen to it for free, and I strongly encourage anyone to do so. This is a fantastic program whether you're into Westerns or not, and I think anybody will get something out of this, but it's just an absolute treasure to find just 20 hours of Jimmy Stewart Western stories that you didn't know existed. And it's such a beautiful series that I enjoyed every episode. So as always, I hope my babblings about the career of James Stewart and Golden Age Radio have been at least somewhat fun and informative. I know talking on YouTube about a classic radio program is probably not going to be popular with the algorithm, but I'm such an enormous lifelong fan of Stewart's films, and again, I think he is arguably the greatest screen actor who ever lived, The fact that suddenly I was able to listen to 20 hours of brand new to me Jimmy Stewart Westerns from the 1950s in his most productive decade that are made and released smack dab in the middle of his landmark Anthony Mann Westerns, to the point of the episodes actually concluding with lines like, "Mr. Stewart can currently be seen in the Universal International production Bend of the River." I mean, as a classic film geek who's obsessed with the Stewart Mann Westerns, that just makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. So these shows are so incredibly well made and are such a wonderful alternate universe into where Stewart's career could have gone, and show how amazing he was as a radio actor as well as a film actor. These shows are so beautifully done that everybody will get something out of them. And that's why I felt I had to talk about them in video form, as this is easily one of the best classic radio programs that I've listened to as I've gotten more and more into Golden Age radio, and especially since they're free and the whole series survives in excellent quality. I just had to gush about it, and I hope that this will encourage people to try this series, as it's truly phenomenal, and you have nothing to lose because you can listen to the entire series for free. I do want to make classic radio programs a bit of a focus on this channel. Basically, I want to talk about shows when I listen to them or finish listening to the surviving episodes, so I can talk about some of the better ones a little bit, and also try to promote the at least some of the history and culture of radio drama, as it is one of the great American art forms that unfortunately isn't just lost to time, it's also lost to history in a lot of ways, because it's such an outdated medium that people don't even think about it unless they get interested in Golden Age radio. But there is some bit of a resurgence now with the rise in popularity of podcasts and audiobooks, and especially audio dramas that are even being done at some points by big broadcast corporations and things. So the idea of the audio-only drama is something that's still with us, and it's still a beautifully effective means of storytelling, so long as the intelligence and craftsmanship and high artistry is there, like you get in the 6-shooter. So as I ride off and search for another classic radio series to dive into, I just want to say, as always, thank you ever so much for watching.
The 6-Shooter is an NBC Radio Network production in association with Review Productions. It is based on a character created by Frank Burt, and the transcribed story is written by him. Mr. Stewart may currently be seen in the Universal International picture, The Glenn Miller Story. Others in the cast were Herb Vigran, John Stevenson, Lamont Johnson, Dal McKinnon, and Old Gabe was played by Bill Johnstone. Special music for this program was by Basil Adlam, and the entire production is under the direction of Jack Johnstone. All characters and incidents were fictitious, and any resemblance to actual characters or incidents is purely coincidental.